That's one of those texts where you might say to yourself, okay, where's he going? There's lots of directions and paths you could take, and I'm going to say something to you that you might not have expected when you heard that reading. But I want you to go back to the book of Ruth. In the Old Testament, I want you to go back to the book of Ruth. I did something kind of different, I suppose, in some ways. I gave the reading for Larry this evening is actually where I plan to end, not where I plan to begin. But I wanted to get especially the last few verses of that reading in your mindset. And I didn't want to give him just a small little piece. I wanted you to see a little more of it. But I want you to think about the idea of humility as is expressed there at the end of verses 5 through 7. And the importance of appreciating humility when it comes to serving and honoring God. And then we're going to see that as parallels to the things that we're going to learn out of the book of Ruth this evening. And so go back into the book of Ruth if you're not there. And really, I just simply titled this lesson tonight, Practical Lessons from the Book of Ruth. A couple years back, I did some with you out of the book of Ruth, but it didn't really take this path. And so I wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about this particular book and this particular circumstance and appreciate the example of Ruth, and not just her, but Boaz and others that are involved in this account. And so if you would, just kind of camp out with me for a little while in the book of Ruth. And let me share with you what I'm simply calling practical lessons from Ruth. And number one, I want you to appreciate that God's wisdom we find is endless. You and I don't always know why God chooses certain paths for us. We don't always know why God sets things in order the way that He does. And I suppose there have been times in our lives where we've grown impatient with the process. We've not appreciated the direction maybe that we felt like we were heading and couldn't quite even figure out, what is God trying to do with my life? How is He trying to use me as His workman? How am I being the laborer that God would desire for me to be? And we're challenged sometimes in allowing for God's wisdom to run its course, and to allow God's wisdom and guidance and instruction to bring us to where we need to be. Now, mark the book of Ruth if you're there, and just take that tassel or whatever you want to call it and stick it there in the book of Ruth and leave it there, because we're going to go back and forth for a moment, but I want to actually begin in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19 and verse 9, as we just simply appreciate in the initial part of our study this evening the infinite wisdom of Jehovah. Now notice in chapter 19 of Leviticus, verse 9, there's an instruction that comes to those who own property, especially those who are farmers or those who plant. He said in verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And so God says to them in this Levitical account that they have a responsibility to, when they go in to harvest the property, to not take every ounce of grain from it. In fact, He says, if it's a piece of ground like that, I want you to leave the corners. If it's a vineyard, I don't want you to strip it of all the grapes that are available. I want you to leave some so that the stranger and the poor don't have to come beg the landowner for anything. They simply can come and glean from those four corners, or they can glean from the leftover grapes that are still there. Go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verse 19. Numbers chapter 24 and in verse 19. Again, the instruction. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. Now, normally you might think once you get a little bit closer to home, and you go, oh, we forgot to go back and collect all those sheaves. We didn't get them all. You might think, well, it would be responsible and a good stewardship kind of thing to go back and grab it. But God says, don't do that. If you forget it, you've forgotten it. Leave it there, because somebody else might be able to benefit from it. You shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. As they would take those trees and beat the boughs of that tree to get the olives off of it, He said, if you look and you see that there's a handful of olives left, Don't go and beat it again and try to get them all off of there. Leave them for those who may have need. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes, verse 21, of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. Now, here's the infinite wisdom of God as I see it. Here's this instruction, this law, and it seems kind of maybe at the moment somewhat arbitrary. He's just kind of giving them instructions. You own a piece of ground, leave the corners. If you own a vineyard, don't strip it clean. If you have olive trees, don't take every single olive off of them. Whatever it is that you have, don't be afraid to leave some behind so the fatherless and the widows and the stranger and the poor don't have to come begging, but they can just simply come and glean what is left in those fields. Now you say, well, that's just the law that God gave. It had no necessarily maybe any great purpose behind it. Well, I want you to think now, fast forward. You come into the book of Ruth in chapter 2. And you recall that Ruth was married to Naomi's son. And Naomi had 2 sons. And her husband dies. And then her 2 sons die. And then one of the daughter-in-laws goes back to her homeland. But Ruth says, your people are my people. Your God is my God. And she goes with Naomi back to her homeland. And when she arrives there, Naomi is familiar to those, but Ruth is a stranger in a foreign land. She's a widow. She's poor. And she's in need. And there was a relative, verse 1 of chapter 2, of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess, the stranger, said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Ahimelech. God's wisdom way back here in His instructions to the Levite priest, way back here in the book of Deuteronomy, has now fast forwarded and now has created benefit that allows for Ruth and Boaz to come together and meet. And that history begins to unfold, all because God knew that it was necessary. In God's wisdom, He knew that it would be beneficial to leave part of the ground, part of the vineyard, a few sheaves behind, so that others who may have need can come and glean from those. I'm amazed sometimes how we see our laws and instructions of God, but maybe we don't fully appreciate what God really had in mind at times. And we don't always fully see the end result of what God desires to come from that. And though we obviously would have had no clue if we were contemporaries, and we may not have seen this coming as it relates to Ruth and Boaz, but I guarantee you God did. And I can't help but believe in His omniscient, His all-knowing mind, that when He prescribed that law back there in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, He not only had Ruth and Boaz in mind, but a whole host of others who would ultimately benefit from that law and that instruction. But here they are. As the wisdom of God unfolds. Friends, you and I don't always know. What God sets up and establishes way back here may bring its fruit to fruition for somebody way out here in the future sometimes. We don't always know what the thought processes or the plan or the purposes that God may have in mind, but He certainly sets the stage. And now Ruth is gaining benefit of a law that had been given so long ago. Read verse 4 with me. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. My simple point, friends, is this. To be helpful, sometimes you've got to pay attention. to be of aid and assistance and help to others. When Boaz arises here, it's interesting that his focus of attention with those who were working for him was not how much have we gathered in today, how much have we stored up, how much profit are we going to make from all that we've gathered together. His first thought process when he shows up on the scene is, who is this young woman out here? Who's gleaning over the leftovers, who's picking up those things that you all were dropping and leaving behind. His concern immediately goes to Ruth. And I think he's a perfect example of you have to be paying attention sometimes in order to be helpful. And sometimes we can get in just a cloud of our own thought processes, and we can get in a cloud of our own little world, and sometimes there are needs that arise and circumstances that are right in front of us, but because we become so tunnel visioned and so focused on what we see as the necessary elements, that we miss out on opportunities to be helpful. I appreciate that Boaz didn't just say, hey, why are you guys leaving so much? And who is this that's getting all this benefit? He's concerned about her when he sees Ruth gleaning in his fields. But then I want you to notice something even more special about him. He doesn't just notice her, by the way. He doesn't just see her and acknowledge that there's somebody gleaning in his fields. But notice verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. And so she fell on her face and bowed down to the ground and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? What I appreciate about Boaz is he now says to her, not just it's okay that you're gleaning from my field, but he says, I want you to stay right here with the other young women that are working for me. You stay right here in this field. And he gives her some comfort, right? In knowing that he's told the young men, stay away. It's like the power of a dad, right? Stay away. But that's what Boaz does. He gives her some reassurances that she's going to be safe if she's gleaning. And don't go over here to this other field because I can't protect you over there. Don't run off to somebody else's land, even though you may have legal right, according to Deuteronomy, according to Leviticus. But don't go running off into another field because I can only protect you right here. But he didn't owe her that. As far as I could tell, within the law, the law that was governing his situation was simply he needed to leave some behind for others to glean from. But there's no indication within the law that he has to give her special privileges and let her stay with his young women and give her all these things. Now jump ahead, verse 14. Because he's not done. Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her. And she ate and was satisfied, and kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. Let her gather what she wants to gather. Even amongst the things that you all were working to gather and put together, let her gather. Even among the sheaves. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposefully for her. You know, that you think about it, if she's left out in the field to just kind of pay attention and watch, maybe there's a group over here and they've dropped some over there, and so she runs over there. But if she sees them purposely leaving it, it makes her work and effort even simpler. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. If sometimes in this life we need to go above and beyond. We have to learn that what's expected sometimes isn't enough. The only legal expectation that she had of Boaz, or anybody else for that matter, was what Leviticus said and what Deuteronomy said. But Boaz recognizes he can be of greater benefit to her if he'll go above and beyond what is expected of him. To go above those simple expectations and actually offer her genuine benefit. He's telling his men, make sure you don't just pick up what you've forgotten, or don't just live by but you leave purposely enough for her to gather together. Sometimes you and I need to be reminded that it's okay to go beyond what's expected. It's okay to go above and beyond what might be normal expectations from others, from our family relationships to our friendships, to the foreigner and stranger, whatever it might be. Boaz is a great example of not just doing enough. He wants to go even beyond that in his help and aid of Ruth. And then I want you to notice with me, go back now to verse 10. That what you and I do for others is witnessed and seen. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? She might expect that he might leave a little for the poor of the native land. But she's a Moabitess, a stranger in his land. Why have you taken notice of me? And Boaz answered and said to her, It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. Now think about that. Stranger comes into town, right? But they're already talking about the good things that Ruth had been doing for her mother-in-law. She is already the talk of the town in a good way. Her example for her love for her mother-in-law and the care that she had been expressing to Naomi, that it had already become known in that area. And Boaz says, I've heard about it. I've heard about the way that you've cared for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and your land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. You know, sometimes the good that we do may not get acknowledged, but in many cases it's seen. There are times where people witness it and they gain a good example and a good benefit from that. There may not ever be any acknowledgement for us going above and beyond what's expected. It's kind of interesting when you think about it, because Boaz is going way beyond what the law required, and he's going way beyond what anybody would have ever expected of him. But that's exactly what Ruth has also done. You remember Naomi said, You go home. You go home. And the other daughter-in-law said, That sounds good to me. Off I go. But Ruth says, Your people are my people. Your God is my God, and I'm not leaving you. It was going to be hard for Ruth to kind of carve out a life. It was going to be difficult, but she was making sacrifices, and it was not going unnoticed. And so Boaz simply returns the favor. Your deeds and my deeds of the good example we set may not get the acknowledgement that we would hope for. And sometimes we grow weary in well-doing because we don't feel like it's having the end results that we're looking for. But Ruth here, by the way, has no idea. I'm convinced from the narrative here, she doesn't have any idea that her conduct and her behaviors had been seen and had become an example to men like Boaz. We don't always know the good that we're doing. We don't always know the results of that good. We don't always have the ability to understand and know exactly what's going on. And sometimes the results don't show themselves in the way that we would like, but good's happening here with Ruth and Boaz. And we need to appreciate that it happens for us sometimes as well. And then I appreciate the practical application of the fact that she wants to acknowledge what's been going on. Then she said, Let me find favor in your sight. There in verse 13 of chapter 2. Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. You know, her willingness to be appreciative is commendable. She could have just taken advantage of the circumstance and Boaz's kindness and not acknowledged it, just kind of took advantage of that whole circumstance. Sometimes we need to stop and show appreciation and thanksgiving for the good that's going on. Sometimes it doesn't go acknowledged, and we need to just simply recognize that sometimes the good that's being fulfilled may not ever be necessarily written down or acknowledged in some way. But on the other side of that, we need to show and express appreciation more. To express our thanks, as she did to Boaz, for his kindness towards her. And then this example, to me, practical example, is powerful. Notice in verse 8 of chapter 2. So she's been gathering, right? He's told her in verse 16, let some of it fall purposefully. He's giving his young men instructions about making sure Ruth gets taken care of. And then notice verse 18. Then she took it up and went into the city. And her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. You remember that earlier in that text? He allows her to come and sit at the table. Says, go ahead and take the bread and dip it in the vinegar, and she gets that parched corn, or that parched grain, I should say. And the text said she put some back, and your mindset might be, well, she's thinking about her own livelihood moving forward, and so she's putting a little back aside, she's putting some in her pocket, if you will, so that when she's hungry later, she'll have enough to fill her belly again. But that's not at all what she was thinking, was it? When she put that back, she wasn't thinking about preserving herself for another meal. She's thinking about feeding her mother-in-law when she gets back. She gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. Even though Ruth was weak herself, and even though she didn't necessarily have a lot to offer, she wasn't just thinking about herself as she gleaned in that field. And sometimes maybe we feel like that well, I'm too in need to be able to be helpful to others. And that's not always true. I can find ways to be helpful and generous and kind and loving, even when I'm in my weakest and most challenged state. I love the disposition of Ruth. She's hungry. I imagine when she sits down to eat that meal out there in that field with Boaz and the rest of them, that's probably the best meal she'd had in a long time. But she's not thinking just about her own belly. She ate till she was satisfied, then she kept some back because she's thinking about her mother-in-law. I guess the point I'm trying to just encourage us to appreciate is that even when we're challenged and even when we feel like that we have needs that we could benefit from others from, that I too should be giving and considerate and helpful and beneficial, even when I might find myself as the weak one. Ruth shared even in that condition. Verse 21. Remember the instructions Boaz told her, don't go over into that field. You stay right here with my maidens that are working in the field. You don't. So she recounts that. Verse 21. Ruth the Moabitess said, he also said to me, you shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field. Now you think about that for a minute. If she gets special privileges, right? If she gets special privileges to be able to get this benefit from Boaz and be able to do all these things and have all these wonderful extra purposefully leaving things for her, and then they find out she's over here in another field somewhere, gleaning from somebody else, that maybe there was somebody else who's poor or some other stranger or somebody else who was in need who could be gleaning over there, but she's hoarding it. And say, Naomi says, you pay attention to his instructions. Don't let anybody see you in any other field. And so she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of barley harvest and wheat harvest. And she dwelt with her mother-in-law. Friends, you and I need to be careful not to abuse the kindness of others. You and I need to be careful that we don't abuse the good that others are doing for us. And that we show appreciation for it. And sometimes we can do that in a lot of ways, but we just need to be mindful that we don't become so greedy over what others are helping me with. And that while here's somebody who's assisting me, but yet I'm also going over here and seeking the same bit of help from others. Don't abuse the kindness of others. Ruth appreciated what Boaz was doing. Naomi warns her, you stick with it. You stick with it. Because Ruth's willingness to humble herself and glean in the fields that Boaz had set aside for her. She humbled herself to go out when it might be not necessarily the most prestigious thing to have to do. Because remember, as people would witness, they would know that that's somebody that's poor out there gleaning from that field. That's the stranger in the land that's out there gleaning from that field. But she humbled herself, recognized her needs and the needs of her mother-in-law, and was willing to go and glean. Friends, sometimes we have to humble ourselves. And sometimes to get things done and to get things accomplished as we should, sometimes we have to glean in another man's field. It means sometimes we won't get the credit. We're not going to be the owner of the field. Sometimes it may not feel like it's all that wonderful or prestigious to be the one who's always seeming to just be picking up the leftovers from the bounty of others. But sometimes even our spiritual service to God, we need to remember that humility will accept. That sometimes it's not about the limelight. It's not about who's getting acknowledged and who's getting credit. But it's about the work and service of God that's being accomplished. And if Jesus Christ is being honored and Jesus is being served and folks are learning about Him and coming to Him, that if my role in that for a period of time is to just glean from another man's field, then that's perfectly fine. Or if it means picking up the sheaves that got left behind. Or if it means just having the leftover grapes. I don't get to pick from the best of the vineyard. I have to accept sometimes what might be left over. But humility will let me do that. Likewise, you younger, verse 5 of 1 Peter 5. Submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another. And be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. Ruth was a living example of casting her cares upon the Lord, for He cared for her. He cared for her long before she ever came into existence. He was caring for her when He had them pen the words, leave the cornfield alone. When He had those Levites pen the words, don't strip the vineyard clean, leave a few grapes behind. when He told them, don't take every olive off the tree. Leave some for the poor and the stranger and the widow. God was caring for Ruth long before Ruth ever came into existence. God was already establishing guidelines, rules, laws, instructions that would provide the care for folks like Ruth long before they ever come on the scene. And my friends, the final point for us simply this evening is this. If we will humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, He will give grace. And you and I don't always know how many things God has already done way back here in the past that have already set the stage for the grace we're going to receive sometime later. Our problem sometimes is we want it now. But it took some time for Ruth and Naomi to make their way back. It took some time for them to eventually recognize, you know what, maybe I should go out and glean from the field. Okay, go over there. It took ending up in the field of a close relative. You know the rest of the story, though. You know it also took the fact that Boaz has got to go down and tell these folks, hey, whoever takes Ruth as a wife gets some land. Oh, great. Oh, but don't forget that if you take her as wife and you have children, they're going to be equal inheritors of all that you owe, not just this piece of ground. Oh, wait a minute. Boaz, you go ahead and you take her for your wife. Now that's the Brian Price summarized version, but that's kind of what it is, right? All because of God's care long before Ruth ever arrived. And if He'll do it for Ruth, and He promises He gives grace to the humble, if I'll humble myself before the Lord, He'll do it for me. I'm convinced of that. And I'm convinced of that because I've seen it already happen in my own life. It's when I'm my most proud. It's when I'm most proud that I get in the most trouble. But when I'm willing to shrink back and humble myself in the sight of the Lord, His infinite grace is so vivid and so wonderful and so purposeful and so beautiful. Will you and I humble ourselves, just like Ruth, be willing to even do things that maybe seems uncomfortable, but recognizing that God's plans and purposes are leading me to the grace that He has to extend unto me if I'll honor Him. Will you and I continue to serve the Lord? I apologize to the folks at home. All they can hear is my voice right now because I walked away from the camera, but that's okay. I want you to appreciate this evening that God's grace is available to you and I. God's grace and His plans and purposes to bring that grace have been long set since the foundations of the world, that Jesus Christ would ultimately come and bring us salvation in Him. They've been long set. Will I humble myself enough that I might receive the grace that God extends to me? Will I show the humility of Ruth and just watch the plans of God just unfold before me as His grace is offered on a daily basis to the humble? If yet to step out into His promises, if we could help you do that tonight, to be baptized into Christ, if we could strengthen you in some way tonight, pray for you in some way tonight, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and He will lift you up. Will you receive salvation in Jesus this evening? And if we could help you do that, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?